Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's discussion about Alain Locke and the New Negro with Jeffrey Stewart and Carl Hancock Rux. Dr. Jeffrey Stewart has taught at Harvard, Yale, UCLA, Tufts, Howard, Scripps, and George Mason universities before becoming chair of the Department of Black Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He was also the director of research at the Smithsonian Institution's Anacostia Museum in Washington, D.C., and also a curator at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery and a senior advisor to the Museum of African American History and Culture in Baltimore, Maryland. He's a graduate of Yale University, where he received not only his Master of Arts, but also a Master's of Philosophy and a PhD in American Studies. He's the author of the book Paul Robeson, Artist and Citizen, and the book 1001 Things Everyone Should Know About African American History. And his new book, The New Negro, The Life of Alain Locke, has just come out from Oxford University Press. The new book has a wonderful review in the New York Times last Thursday, and we're very excited to hear more about it tonight. Professor Stewart is going to start tonight's program by giving us an overview of the book and about the life of Alain Locke, and then he'll be joined by Carl Hancock Rux for a wider discussion about the Harlem Renaissance and its continuing legacy. Carl Hancock Rux is an award-winning poet, playwright, novelist, essayist, and recording artist. He's the author of several books, including the poetry collection Pagan Operetta, which won the Village Voice Literary Prize, the novel Asphalt, and the Obie Award-winning play Talk. He's also been a frequent guest performer in dance projects, collaborating with the Bill T. Jones Arnie Zane Dance Company, the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, the Urban Bushwomen, and with choreographer Martha Clark. He received a Bessie Award for directing the dance musical Stained, and he originated the title role in the folk opera production of The Temptation of St. Anthony, directed by Robert Wilson at the Brooklyn Academy of Music and at the Paris Opera. He curated the We the People's Cabaret, originally presented each September by the Harlem Stage. His CDs include Rux Review, Apothecary RX, Good Bread Alley, and Homeostasis. He's the subject of a Voices of America television documentary called Carl Hancock Rux Coming of Age, and he was the host of the WBAI radio show Live from the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. He was a correspondent for XM Radio's The Bob Edwards Show, and is a frequent guest host on WNYC's Soundcheck. He co-wrote and narrated the radio documentary Walt Whitman, Songs of Myself, which was awarded the New York Press Club Journalism Award for Entertainment News. He's the recipient of several other awards, including the New York Foundation for the Arts Prize, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Bessie Schomburg Award, and the coveted Cal Arts Herb Alpert Award in the Arts. At the end of tonight's program, I want to invite you all to join us in the theater lobby for a book signing hosted by our dear friends at Isawan Books. And we'll have some refreshments there as well, so we can all hang out and talk after what will be a very thought-provoking discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Jeffrey Stewart.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Claudia Bester for arranging this event, Zachary Price for putting me in touch with Claudia, and Janani Subramanian, who's coordinated just a wonderful set of connections, and of course, Ann Philbin, the director of the Hammer Museum, and I also want to thank James Fugate, who's owner of Isawan Books, who's going to be handling the book signing. Of course, I especially want to thank Carl Hancock Rux for agreeing to come and talk with me about Alain Locke, and my friends Vince Johnson and Yuvia Mera, Hugh Ganny, who, Ben Caldwell, artists who have really helped me in ways they probably don't know, to understand Alain Locke, whose life really revolved around the support of artists and the enabling of them to do what they need to do to be great and to change the way in which Black people in particular are perceived in our culture. So Claudia mentioned I was going to give an overview, and I was thinking, wow, that would be a lot to do. And I was trying to think about, okay, what is it about this book that's somewhat unique or different, that stands out, and something that I discovered doing working on it. So one of the things I discovered on it, which was kind of interesting, was that it was actually in San Remo, Italy, that Alain Locke was able to achieve the breakthrough to write what became his signature essay, The New Negro, which appeared in the Survey Graphic and became the title of his book, and which is now the title of my book. Italy, where he was vacationing and really writing about Harlem. So we have this sense in our culture that we have to be embedded in the place that we're talking about in order to write about it. And it's kind of interesting that he went far away, really, not only in terms of distance, but also perhaps culture orientation, to write this essay. And so I thought to myself, maybe starting out with just asking that question, why is it that Alain Locke had to go to San Remo, Italy, in order to write the essay that would become the launch of the Harlem Renaissance? And then, even more than that, not just simply Italy. He also was a person who, let's see if I can get the next slide, who spent a lot of time in Berlin. He was often somewhat of a partial expatriate, someone who was often in Europe and away from the United States. Let me get this back here. Yeah. Writing about blackness in the United States. Why is that? What is it about the transnational that allowed him to identify with the local and home? And so I sort of thought about that for a while, and thought about how that right after his mother died in 1922, he basically was off to Berlin, where he, was essentially not doing what Mark Twain talked about with The Innocents Abroad, doing the grand tour. He was actually a kind of exile from the United States. And in that exile, found resources to come back home and to see home in a completely different way. And so when I think of this notion of exile, I'm saying essentially that it's not the case, as is typical in the American, grand tour or whatever, that you go abroad and you experience the rest of the world culture almost as a kind of artifact of your own subjectivity, and then you come home and you go back to doing what you were doing all along anyway, right? I mean, he essentially is a person who's on the run often in his life. In 1907, he is selected as the first African-American Rhodes Scholar, and he goes to Oxford. And in his letters to his mother, he basically says, if things work out for me, America may never see me again. So that's that sense of exile, trying to escape the racial nightmare that was the early 20th century for most African Americans. But the problem is abroad, he could not actually escape race. In fact, his real experience of the most intense racism of his life was at Oxford, where Southern Rhodes Scholars were extremely upset that something that was honorific for them, going to England, the site of Anglo whiteness, there's this black young man there. So they made his life miserable, and the Rhodes Trust actually colluded with them to exclude him from activities that were considered appropriate for Americans. So even going abroad was not necessarily a way to escape from race. So this is a struggle for him throughout, is that he feels the need to be in Europe and away from the United States, and yet abroad he cannot escape the very issue that drove him abroad. So instead he leaves Oxford and goes to Berlin, And in Berlin, he begins to experience a type of freedom that he had never experienced before, a freedom from racial, but also sexual repression. Locke was gay and particularly found in the United States that was very difficult. In Berlin, it was a very open society. He went to the University of Berlin. He wanted to stay there. The culture of the Weimar Republic, particularly in 1922, after his mother's death, essentially modeled for him an open society, an urban society that was built around aesthetic values that he felt very close to. He was also in Europe able to experience African art for the first time. African art was very difficult to find in the United States at this time. He learned in a way that in Europe, particularly certain places in Europe, particularly France and Germany, Africa was actually looked at in positive terms. It was essentially the linchpin for the emergence of modernism, of abstraction, of conceptualism in art. And they were talking about it in those terms as a source of creativity for the new change in modern European society, whereas back at home, everything African was seen as negative and primitive and unsophisticated. So part of the answer to this is that when he goes abroad, he's able to escape how Americans look at black people and to buy into a more world view that still has problematic aspects to it. Obviously, France is a colonial nation during his period of time, and so is Germany. But nevertheless, there's some spaces in there for him to actually begin to see that Africa is not what he's learned all during his upbringing as being a place where there is no culture, that there is culture there, and it's actually an aesthetic that is transforming how Europeans are going to do art when Picasso and others coming forward. So part of the answer is that he's able to find his own culture and see his own culture through the European lens. But Sanremo was interesting in another sense. This is in 1924 that he was there. And this was after he had come abroad during the summer of 24 in pursuit of a man who he was very infatuated with, Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was living in Paris, and Locke sort of tracked him down, and they began to go out and talk, and Locke introduced Hughes to those parts of Paris that he wasn't familiar with. They also went to Venice, which Locke knew very well, and essentially narrated the whole world of sophisticated Renaissance art that was there. But Locke also was pursuing Langston Hughes romantically. And at a certain point, Hughes decided that he wasn't going to consummate their relationship. And so Hughes came up with a story, I mean, it probably was true, that he had fallen asleep on a train and been robbed and lost his passport. So he couldn't get back into Italy to meet up with Locke. And Locke was, of course, very angry and very disappointed. A big part of his life was this unfulfilled longing for a soulmate. His mother had been that before. After she died in 1922, he was a very lonely, felt abandoned as a human being. He was always looking for that gifted person, that artist who would also be a lover. And by this act, Hughes was saying, that's not going to be me. But something very interesting happened. Locke didn't seem to get particularly upset. He sent a few dollars to Hughes. He didn't come to France to rescue him. He went to Sanremo. And he sat there on the verandas, in the restaurants, free of segregation. And he began to write. And he began to write about the new Negro. And I believe this is because even though the relationship with Hughes didn't produce a long-term romantic relationship, it produced an intellectual breakthrough. because Langston Hughes, of all of the artists of the 1920s, with the possible exception of Zora Neale Hurston, identified with the black working class, identified with the idea that the black working class was the source of the creativity that was black culture. And Locke had difficulty with this idea. He had grown up in Philadelphia in a black Victorian family that his mother basically told him not to associate with lower class kids. He had tremendous bias and even to a certain extent color consciousness. But Hughes didn't. Hughes would hang out with the working class. When he was living in Washington, he would hang out on 7th and T and listen to the people from the South who came up with the blues. And some people say, take those blues almost literally and turn them into poetry. Because those blues people were the authoritarian voice of black culture. And he talked to Locke about this. He told them that's the people who are the most important people. That's the site of blackness, not the people who you think are, sophisticated and assimilated. It's the unassimilated, the people who actually come from the earth, who've spent generations growing cotton and other things for other people. Those are the people who are the source of creativity. And so the blues in particular, which Locke never really liked, Hughes said was the source of creativity. And so this is kind of one of the things that I really explore a lot in this book is the relationships with people as well as with ideas that propelled Locke forward. And I think that's one of the important things that we learn from biography is that it's not just the ideas, the books, the concerts, the art galleries. It's the kinds of people that we associate with. And if we are open to them, they can actually enlighten us. Was actually Hughes, I think, who really began to make Locke realize that while segregation was tremendously painful to him, particularly because he wanted to go to concerts and he lived in Washington, D.C., taught at Howard University. He couldn't go to the nice hotels there. He couldn't go to concerts. Even when he went to Baltimore to hear classical music, he was often segregated. And this was very painful for him because in Europe he never was. Yet Hughes also said there's something about segregation that's pulling us together. It's a crucible. It's a hothouse of creativity. And that out of segregation, African Americans are creating congregation. They're creating a new aesthetic, a new way of being together that doesn't actually have to worry about what black people and what white people think and say about them. And this was kind of a revelation, I think, that went on in their conversations as they went on back and forth about that. And also the idea that blues is not just entertainment or even just a musical form, that it's a source of knowledge, that it's a mode of explanation, that there's knowledge being communicated through song and through form that tells the story of what it was like for those people who were emancipated, but not really emancipated by the Civil War, who were thrown out to the sea of American culture without any money, without any property, without any capital, and yet somehow or other found in the blues form a way of liberating themselves, of telling the story of the cruelty of America in such a way that it became beauty. And so that's the thing that I think Hughes and Locke were able to create. Maybe not a relationship, romantic, but a sense of the beauty of black people came out of their relationship, and that taught Locke something that he needed to be able to appreciate to write that essay. Of course, it was also in Europe, in Berlin in particular, that he would hear the great singer Roland Hayes, who would sing German Lieder and that's why the Germans liked him. But he would also include the spirituals on the program with the German leader. And the spirituals, which was essentially Locke's favorite musical form, was produced by enslaved people under slavery. And yet still, under the worst times that our people experienced, were able to turn that into a musical form that was completely innovative, transformed Anglican hymns, and really was the first great American music. That came out of a kind of a dungeon, and that Locke needed to be able to see that and appreciate that, and he saw that when he was in Europe. Of course, even in the period of time, 1920s, America was still committed to the idea of treating young people like Langston Hughes and others as if they were still enslaved. Locke, I think, helped these young men, particularly, and some women like Zora Neale Hurston, to fortify themselves against those things that would tend to distract them from being able to follow their muse and be able to create the art that they need to. I also want to say that the transnationalism also meant that Locke found allies among Europeans. Often Europeans who themselves were kind of exiles from the hyper-nationalism of their countries. And so this was particularly the case with Vino Reis, who was a German artist who came over in 1913, who essentially was an exile from Bismarckian Germany, who really hated actually doing portraits for the American elite, but loved painting portraits of Native Americans, Mexicans, and African Americans in Harlem. And he was drawn into the project to create a special issue of Survey Graphic in 1925 that would announce the new Negro as being a new subjectivity in Harlem. And so it was actually this German who designed this special issue, not only drawing the portrait of Roland Hayes, which is on the cover, but also designing the whole framework for it, so that in a way you see this as kind of a text of the Harlem Renaissance, where African Americans migrating up from the North are now embedded in a modernist industrial civilization, or literally here. And then also the way in which he designed the front so that Harlem, Mecca of the new Negro, not a ghetto, not a place people are trying to get away from, but a place people are tending toward. And of course, what Vino Reis did was to come up with a signature design that kind of captured sort of the Africanicity of that, even in the lettering that he used. Berlin was, of course, very important for Locke. He returned over and over again. I think Berlin helped him see the aesthetic possibilities and aspects of Harlem just from a design standpoint. I think the idea of people migrating to Berlin during the Weimar Republic was in some ways a metaphor of people migrating to Harlem. The intellectuals that were associated with Harlem was something that Locke, I think, in particular, pointed up more than anyone else. And the diversity within Black culture, I think, was something that Locke really wanted to emphasize for us, that being Black was not one thing, not just one subjectivity. It was, as he said, that it's attracting the African, the West Indian, the Negro American. It's brought together the Negro of the South and the Negro of the North, the man from the city and the man from the town and village, the peasant, the student, the businessman, the professional man, artist, poet, musician and adventurer, worker. Their greatest experience has been the finding of one another. That's what a Mecca does. It brings people together. And through that, he felt a new identity called the new Negro, which was confident, full of pride, full of a sense of culture, that you had something and that you also had a voice, that you had something to contribute, something to say that was unique in America. And you could say that even while being an American. That was the unique cultural mission, essentially, that Locke had as his own particular one. Max Reinhardt was another European who was very much involved with a German modernist theater. He taught Locke to appreciate essentially the artistic capacity to affect the people. And I think that this is something that later in Locke's life became very important. He constantly reinvented himself. And I think when I think about my great friend Eleanor Traylor, I remember she used to say when we were talking a long time ago about Roots, and she was saying, Roots was a very good book, and she liked it, but that African American culture, as she saw it, was not primarily looking backward, that it was actually not looking for roots. What it really came out of was the ability to create culture out of rootlessness, out of being thrown onto the sea of the diaspora and making something new out of it, and constantly recreating yourself, whether it's the spirituals, whether it's the blues, whether it's jazz, whether it's hip hop in the coming out of the Bronx, taking that thrown awayness and turning it into a new form is one of the constant talents of reinvention of aesthetic and also personality. And that's something I think that comes through in Locke's own career. That's why I call him the new Negro. He's the new Negro in a sense, not only because he's advocating that, but he's also practicing that and embodying that, and also trying to share that culture as he did with a curator of the 1939 exhibit, the first real exhibit of African American art in a major museum, the Baltimore Museum of Art, putting that art up there for children and others to see, to be empowered and ennobled and inspired by. That, I think, was his gift to us, that this art has a work to do in our culture, to giving those children the ability to speak out of their experience. And just I wanted to end this with a little someone who I think also articulates this very well, the poet Jane Cortez. Could you please play that? Cue that up, please. Thank you.
Find your own voice and use it. Use your own voice and find it. Find your own voice and use it. Use your own voice and find it. Find your own voice and use it. Use your own voice and find it. Find your own voice and use it. Use your own voice and find it. The sounds of drizzle on dry leaves are not like sounds of insults between pedestrians. Those women laughing in the window do not sound like air conditioners on the blink. The river turtle does not breathe like a slithering boa constrictor. The roar of a bull is not like the cackle of a hyena. Find your own voice and use it. Use your own voice and find it. Find your own voice and use it. Use your own voice and find it. The growl of a sea leopard is not like the teething cry of a baby. The slash of a barracuda is not like the gulp of a leaping whale. The speech of a tiger shark is not like the bark of an eaglefish. The scent of a gardenia is not like the scent of a tangerine. Find your own voice and use it. Use your own voice and find it. Find your own voice and use it. Use your own voice and find it. Find it. Find it. Find it. Find it. Find it.
So Locke would want us to find our voice. Thank you very much. Carl, could you come on up and we can come over here and chat a bit.
Let's give him another hand, if you don't mind. That was
Thank you.
incredibly moving on so many levels for me personally. One, because Jane Cortez was a good friend of mine and a mentor, and someone who I admired and spent a lot of time with, and loved that métier, the idea of finding your own voice. And I think that when you speak about Locke in the way that you were speaking about him, there's something else that really strikes me as incredibly interesting and groundbreaking for its time, which is a marriage between, or at least the identity of, black people or people of color, or the Negro, this new Negro, as marrying both the intellectual and the artistic, which prior to, let's say, this era that he's beginning to form his philosophy, there's sort of there's a separatism in a way. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes,
right?
yes.
That one could be black and intellectual, but you did not sing the blues, or
Right.
you didn't engage in jazz, or you didn't dance. That these in fact were two separate entities of blackness, right?
Right.
And so there's something about there's something that we begin to learn and understand and embrace through his philosophy, literally and metaphorically, about the relationship between the arts and the intellect. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, yes. So I think that you're right. I mean, before this Harlem moment, the two, shall we say, dominant orientations was the Booker T. Washington one, which was to create a very strong petty bourgeois class, entrepreneurs, and that would sort of, create a middle class, and that was tended to be very conservative. You emulated capitalist values, and you were going to become a middle class, and that intellectual side was, capitalist. And then you had W.B. Du Bois, who argued that it was largely through criticality towards the American project, a very political form of, and he was the triumphant intellectual of that time. And he, believed in art. He did an essay on the spirituals in the souls of black folk, but it was always subverted. It was always secondary to politics. And Locke and he ended up in a huge controversy during the 1920s, where Du Bois became jealous of Locke becoming very prominent, and also the idea that art would be the dominant thing that black people would involve. And Du Bois had a famous line. He says, "All art is propaganda, either for or against the race, and any art that's not propaganda, I don't want to have anything to do with it." And Locke reacted against that and thought that was truncating the kind of work that art could do in a community. So you're right. I mean, the work of Paul Laurence Dunbar, that was such beautiful, profound poetry, was not thought of as intellectually respectable. So yes, that division internally existed. But I think Locke gave a certain intellectual heft to the argument about art that hadn't been there before.
Right. So thus you get people like Zora Neale Hurston, people like Langston Hughes, who begin to explore. Well, Langston Hughes certainly exploring a blues vernacular, right? A blues linguistic in his poetry, right? People like Zora Neale Hurston, who is studying anthropology, but of course, dealing with the South, embracing her Southern roots, her Southern vernacular, actually really giving, I guess, a real science to how the language of the South existed, right?
Yes.
And how people spoke and what the culture of the South was, as opposed to how it had been written, but let's say by white people who basically just put a D and replace the THs with the D.
Yes.
And said, this is how black people talk, right? So
Yeah.
you know, she's saying, you know,
she's really transliterating
exactly,
dialect.
Right. So she attacks this, you know, and attacks the, you know, which, because that's huge at the time. I mean, it's huge. I mean, especially when you think about, you know, the era of the 20s, the 30s, this Gershwin principle, right, of Porgy and Bess, right, and you look at, you know, someone like Gershwin or Du Bois Haywood, you know, going down to South Carolina and writing, you know, this novel, which becomes this play, which becomes this opera, right, and then, but in a sense, really is only a flat depiction of blackness, and especially of Southern culture, you know? And so then she actually begins to make it her life's work to embrace this, even to the point of critique, you know, by people like writers who came along later.
But there's an intelligence
in
this work that is often glossed over, and particularly it's critical of what's been done to the people, and that's embedded in that. And I think there is an intellectual history really to be done of the rural South and the kinds of poems and blues that are a form of explanation. As my late friend Clyde Wood said, the blues is a form of explanation. It's an epistemology of what has gone on in America, and it's condemned as not being intellectual because that's one way of not hearing that critique, with the critique that you're talking about. So Locke had to, I think for Locke the thing is, he had to overcome the brainwashing that his middle class culture had given him in order to appreciate this form, a brainwashing that was just as powerful as was done to whites at that time. And part of the reason he got away and went abroad was also to escape from the Du Boisian, NAACP, upper middle class way of thinking, which also kept him from appreciating it. So he had a double struggle against, you know, the dominant white narrative in America that this material is not important, and then an internal bourgeois black narrative of the elite that said it wasn't important. And I think it was people, ciphers like Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, who taught him to appreciate his own culture in a new way.
And this gets him in trouble a little bit. Like, let's can you talk a little bit about like when he was at Howard University and when he becomes when he enters into the realm of academia. And of course, many of us, when we think about Howard University, we think about it is this bastion of, and it is this bastion of, a black intellectual elitism and an academy of understanding ourselves and our Negroness. But when he becomes an academic there, one of the things he gets in trouble for and actually fired for is this idea, right, around that he's writing about a plurality of blackness. Yeah,
and black self-determination. You know, I think that there was always a kind of tension at Howard between, on the one hand, it was an institution that was for the freed people and for their education and liberation, but then also it received a lot of financial support so that, you know, it was also something of a control mechanism. And particularly up until the time that Locke was fired, it always had a white president. And Locke, it's a tremendous irony, you know, that he publishes this fantastic issue of Survey Graphic declaring the cultural self-determination of black people in March, and in June he's fired. And he's fired essentially because he was associated with these young professors and others, also students, who were rebelling against the strictures and the moral strictures, you know, things like they had to attend chapel and all those sorts of things that were kind of carryovers from the Reconstruction period to discipline and police students so that they would be controllable when they went out into this society. And Locke rebelled against that, and he became a target, and he was kicked out. I think that one of the things, though, is Locke carried on a campaign against those who were his enemies and eventually got his job back. And being fired helped him because it forced him to reinvent himself as a critic, as someone who lived from his publications, from being a curator, from essentially living off of his wits and his writing. So he actually became a writer like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, the people who didn't have university jobs, having to survive out there. And I think that taught him something about surviving as an artist that made him appreciate the predicament that artists were up against writing this new kind of art.
That is so profound to me because I'm always thinking about how we learned to unlearn, and especially in academia. You know, I was just involved with a good friend of mine, Stanley Nelson, who did and maybe some of you saw it, hopefully, the documentary that just came out called Tell Them We Are Rising, which was about historical black colleges, which is on PBS. I don't know if any of you saw it or not. Yes, at least there's one person. Okay, good. About HBCUs, yes, good. Marlo, of course, is a Howard grad. Yeah. And watching that documentary, it was sort of amazing because one of the things that's brought out is, you know, when you're looking at the early, you know, that early era of historically black colleges, what we were learning, you know, and then the shift and the change, right? In how we begin to unlearn what we're learning, right?
Yes.
That we're colonizing ourselves to believe something, right? And then we have to uncolonize ourselves,
yes.
right? In order to actually emancipate ourselves again from, you know, this prison, you know, this imprisonment of believing what blackness was and how blackness was supposed to be.
And that purely assimilating into the mainstream of America would free you. Because I think Locke and Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston began to say, you know, we shouldn't be integrating into a burning house. You know, we should be essentially recreating that house in the image of that part of American history and that part of a culture that's left out of the story. And I think that, you know, that's the work that's still to be done. I think we're still engaged in that struggle.
Can you talk something that I have a real question about, which is, and I'll say it the most simplistic way that I can possibly say it, which is what happened. Because the reason I say what happened is that you have this era of the 1920s. You have the Harlem Renaissance, right? You have people like Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Wallace Thurman, you know, all these writers who actually are beginning to write about sexuality, right? Homosexuality, prostitutes, you know, all within black culture, embracing the blues aesthetic and all these things. This begins to define, you know, Zora Neale Hurston, who's really beginning to write about the South and all. And then it seems to fall away for a period, right? It's, you know, you've got Locke who's embracing it, and then there becomes this vapid hole, in a way, where we move away from understanding what the plurality of blackness is.
Yes.
Until we get to another point in our history,
and usually comes back in the 60s with the Black Arts Movement.
Right.
Yes, I mean, I think that Locke, you know, if you read the book, you see that constantly he's blocked by all sorts of forces, sometimes by the black establishment, often by, you know, a white establishment that can't figure out whether or not this is going to be a threat to the whole system. Even the people who help him, like Charlotte Mason, a millionaire white patron who ended up funding Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, she had a number of what can only be really described as pathological ideas about black people that eventually destroyed their ability to benefit from the sort of contributions that she made. Locke was unable to put together a powerful enough network of black intellectuals and artists throughout the nation who would work together and in concert. He was often opposed. Some of this, I think, was some of his own fault. I mean, I think that his need to control people and also to mix his advocacy of a kind of liberation philosophy with also his pursuit of intimacy with people often made it very difficult. And, he was really never had the resources. One of the things that was very frustrating to me when I was working on the Mrs. Mason part is Locke wanted to create a museum of African art in Harlem. And so Mrs. Mason gave him some money, but then she said, well, the black people ought to support this themselves, right? And so, she'd give a little money, but she wanted him to go out and ask a number of marginally employed black people to put huge amounts of money into this thing. She never gave him $20,000-$30,000, which she could have easily done given how much, to actually establish that museum. And so that's one of the tragedies. And recently, I was looking in the newspaper and found that somebody was trying to establish an African art museum as recently as a couple of years ago in Harlem, and that effort also collapsed. So there's something about this idea of having a powerful citadel of black artistic efficacy in the United States that is seen as either not being worth investing in or as a threat. And so I think that's why we continue to keep coming around every so often. I have to say that during the 1940s, particularly with the World War II, what I call a kind of integrationist poetics emerged, where the whole idea was to assert that we are part of America. And that became very big with people like Richard Wright, but especially Ralph Ellison, people who, even, Stanley Crouch to a certain extent, even more recently, jazz is an American music, that as being the argument, and really putting down the idea of a black formation. But it's in 1968, though, that Locke's New Negro is republished by Arnold Press and the New York Times, along with a slew of other books, because it's the black student rebellion of the 1960s that creates this hunger for a sense of black efficacy. And a lot of the books that Locke published in the 1930s that went out of print in the 40s and 50s essentially were republished and reappreciated by a different generation.
Right. So we get Locke dying in 1952. We don't get
1954.
54.
Yeah.
We don't get a black museum or studio museum of Harlem until 1970. Right. Which so there's all these things that are happening. Right. The World War II has happened, and the 50s, the McCarthy era has happened, and of course Marxism or the idea of a McCarthyism. Right?
Yes.
And how that's trying to be on the right side of blackness.
Yes.
Then there's sort of a white ownership too, which I think that can't be miscounted.
Right.
And which I think you're speaking to, not just Charlotte Mason, who did own a lot of the work that she funded, right? I mean, because it's sort of amazing to read about how, I don't know if you've ever read, if any of you in the audience have ever read any of the books that have come out. One of the ones that always blows my mind, of course, is to read like Zora Neale Hurston's letters, the Book of Letters, the constant correspondence maybe between Carl Van Vechten and Langston Hughes, and to realize that this woman who was an early funder, because there was no NEA, there was no
NEH,
there was no sort of national funding for the arts necessarily. That someone like Mason who starts this and funds these people is also responsible for deciding what happens with that work, and whether
she owned
the work,
Zora Neale Hurston's work, and Zora Neale Hurston had to get a release from her to publish her own work. And of course, I mean, this was, highly, problematical from our modern standpoint. But if you go back into the Harlem Renaissance, the patrons often owned the artwork that was being produced, but it had a racialized aspect to it when Mason did it. But this is very typical of the 20s and 30s. I mean,
not just the artwork, but also the research.
Yes,
right? I mean,
because the research, the actual research, that she did.
Right.
And she was giving her $200 a month to do it. But today you can get $200 a month for doing research, and the entity doesn't own it. That was a phase of personal patronage, which eventually is eclipsed by more institutional patronage that we sort of have today. And this was a kind of transition period. But I've created his last name, Irving. I can't remember his last name. Who was a promoter, PR person for Duke Ellington, had his name on many of the compositions. So the black artist, as well as the intellectual, had this problem of declaring through their creativity their self-determination, but being caught by the fact that to get the time and money you needed to be successful, you had to depend on patrons who had their own interests, and that interest usually meant to profit from black creativity.
Right, which is sort of interesting, even about what is it, Imitation of Life? Is that the when Zora's working for? What's the writer's name? I'm sorry. Fanny.
Yes.
Somebody help me.
Fanny something.
What's her name? Yes, Fanny Hurst. Right.
Yeah.
So so Fanny Hurst is Zora's working for her as a secretary. I'm sure exchanging all kinds of conversations with her
right.
and around black culture. Right. Fanny Hurst then writes this sort of ridiculous kind of novel around
passing.
They're passing and
right,
exactly, and so and there's a lot of that. I mean, there's Van Vechten who's doing that. There's Fanny Hurst that's doing that. There are other writers who are doing that. So there's again this continued kind of white ownership, or at least a white a profit, of what becomes, thought of as profitably black.
Right, but I will say what's interesting about it now that you mentioned it, and I'm thinking about it right now, is that with the Europeans like Vino Rice, for example, or Max Reinhardt, they didn't do that. It's kind of interesting. I mean, Vino Rice gave all sorts of free work to Locke and others, did portraits for him, did not try to commodify. I mean, obviously he benefited from being around him, but he did portraits of King Amoa, for example, and allowed Locke to use that in an essay on Africa. There were some people who actually really believed in the movement, and there were those who didn't really believe. And that was, of course, the tricky thing. How do you determine who's really behind you? And the desperateness of not Langston Hughes is really the first African-American writer who makes a living solely from his writing. So, he's basically dependent on finding people who will support him and manipulating around that support to get a little bit of freedom to do what he needs to do, but at the same time recognizing he's caught. He's dependent. Something of that comes out in the art and maybe says something about art in general in America, that all of it is somewhat caught in this sort of capitalist patronage nexus.
So how does agency come about? I guess for the black artist. I mean,
right.
And I guess one of the things I'm surprised about, even though your book, of course, is about Locke, but I guess I'm speaking a little bit about the inheritance of a Lockean, if I could put it that way.
Yes.
Right. A Lockean, being or idea of being both an intellectual and an artist, and being free enough to say exactly what it is you want to say. How do we get to the point of a Baldwin, a Richard Wright, what do you think produces that? And those things are happening within Locke's lifetime, thereabout, right?
Yes.
So how does that
Well,
happen?
people like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, when they were working for Mrs. Mason, they squirreled away some time to work on some projects she didn't want them to work on. You take the money and you give the patron what they want, but then you also work on what you also had. And eventually they ended up breaking up the relationship. But one of Langston Hughes' most powerful books, The Ways of White Folks, he wrote after he left Mason and really meditates on that. That condition. So, in part, leaving the patron is also part of the story. And I think, Hughes is able finally to do that. I will say that, the artist is in such a weak position in American culture in general that to have someone who says they believe in you as well as giving you money is a very powerful narcotic. And so it was very difficult for Hughes to exit that. And somebody like Zora Neale Hurston, who stayed with Mason even longer. And I mean, it's just painful to be reading the last sort of letters to that she's writing to Mrs. Mason as Mrs. Mason is beginning to cut off the money for Zora Neale Hurston. And Zora Neale Hurston writes and says, I've come up with this great recipe for chicken soup. And I'm going to make this chicken soup and I'm going to sell this chicken soup. And you're thinking, God, Zora Neale Hurston's going to have to sell some chicken soup to survive? And then she ends up dying penniless and forgotten, really, until Alice Walker really comes along and rediscovers her. So part of this, the pain of doing this research at this time is seeing, what black creatives have had to go through, and yet part of the benefit or joy of it is bringing that life, bringing that history back alive, as Alice Walker did when she looked for Zora Neale Hurston's gravestone and didn't find her, and then carried out this campaign to find where she was buried. And that's kind of the work, reclamation work, that I think historians and artists and intellectuals can do today that is sustaining to us. Because, as bad as things are for us, we realize that other people have struggled and yet found some agency to write. Because when you put the pen to paper, you can write what you want. It just depends on who you're going to show it to. And you may have to be very strategic about who you show it to and when.
One of the things that I did, so I wrote a play some years ago, which is actually about the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of the characters, a lot of the people we're talking about were in that play. It was actually performed here in Los Angeles. But there's a letter. There was a letter that I found when I was in a library. It was not in a library. I was in a bookstore, and Barnes and Noble. You sort of walking around Barnes and Noble, like everybody does, and I found this book. It was a book of correspondence with Du Bois, right? Of his letters. I don't know if you've read that book or not. And there's a letter from Zora Neale Hurston to Du Bois, and which I rewrote and put into the play in my own way. But I can't quote it, verbatim.
Right.
But I will say this: that I'll never forget sitting on the floor. Because you can sit on the floor in Barnes and Noble between the rows and read a book, and reading this letter, and just first going through these stages, first of being astounded by the letter, and then being in tears by the end of it, which was because she writes it at the point when her career is done. She's forgotten. She's not being published. She's not being thought about. She's not working, at least as a writer. And she writes this letter to Du Bois. You probably know the letter I'm talking about, where she says, "Dear Dr. Du Bois, I see that you're still I've read something and I see that you're still in Harlem, and you're still doing your thing or whatever. But there's one thing that you've forgotten to do, and so I would like to suggest that you do this one thing, because of all the things that you've done for black people and for black artists, there's one thing that you have not done, which is, so I'm going to propose it here, that you actually build a cemetery for the illustrious Negro dead." And she goes on to say, she suggests that he should come down to Florida, where she is when she's writing this letter. And she says, you should come down here to Florida because we've got land and you can buy it for 10 cents an acre, and you can get land somewhere near the water, near water, so the dead can listen to each other speak. And she begins to propose this, and the letter becomes really elaborate, where she starts to talk about what should happen in this cemetery. That there should be no statues of Jesus or Mary, and she says because that's what got us into this trouble to begin with, in her great Zora Neale Hurston way. Right. And she says, but I suggest that maybe there be a statue of High John the Conqueror at the gate, and that we should also remove the bones of Nat Turner and Harriet Tubman, and we should put them here, on this grave site, so that people forever, so the black artists, from this point onward, will be able to come and look over these fields of bones and summon their muse, right?
Wow.
And she goes on. The letters, it's unbelievable. It literally leaves you crying. And in what's profound about it is that Du Bois doesn't quite understand what she's talking about.
Right.
Because that was one of the most amazing things about Hurston, was that she was incredibly smart, but she had this wit, So she wasn't literally suggesting that he, create this, this cemetery for the Negro dead, but she was actually saying something else. And the sad part, one of the sad things, is his response, which he takes some time before he even responds to her, and he writes her back and he says, oh, Zorn, it's good to hear from you, and I haven't heard from you in a while, and I'm so glad that you're still alive, basically, I thought you were dead, that kind of thing, and I have no way to know how to do such a thing, but, if you decide to do that, then, let me know how I can help, or whatever. She's talking about remembrance, I guess. She's talking about, holding on to an identity and a moment and a consciousness that was real, that we did not completely hold on to and or embrace in order to move forward.
And a community.
A community
among the dead that would sustain the community that's
for
living.
the living, exactly.
Yeah. Whereas Du Bois was doing that through publishing yet another autobiography every 10, 15 years, right? I mean, that's his shrine. Right. I think that's the kind of, I'm just thinking, I think is it Brian or Brian Stevenson now, who has proposed that there be a shrine at every place in the United States where there was a lynching. I think that's not the same thing, but that same notion of memory. That those people not be forgotten, and that remembering them will somehow or other make us more ethical, responsible people. And I guess in her case would be the sort of alternative to that forgetfulness that you're talking about that occurs in the 40s and 50s, that then has to wait until the 60s and 70s to be reignited, because those young people of the 60s would have had somewhere to go. Even if it wasn't a literal cemetery, it should have been, Locke's idea was a museum of African art, because that's really a citadel to the dead, to the rip-off of those civilizations. So yes, that project of memory is often carried out only through literature, at least that I can see. And that's why your work is so important in you keeping that alive through writing, because I think writing is one of the things that has been so important to us, and I think Locke did that. And now we sort of lack a figure like Locke who's reviewing. That's one of the things he would do. He would review what's coming out, and he would have a retrospective review of the literature of every year by black people, to sum up what was good, what were the trends, which direction should we go in. I mean, it'd be wonderful for him to be here to talk about the Afrofuturism and Black Panther and what does that mean in terms of where we're going. We don't quite have that stewardship now.
What we do have, and I have to, this is, I don't need to be agreed with necessarily when I say this, but I say this in a way that I have to be honest. It does bother me to some degree. Mm-hmm. Is that there is a level of there are black intellectuals that we know of, right? That some of whom we revere, and who write books, but there seems to be a culture of attack. I think that's come about, and almost to the degree which. The thesis or the métier or the philosophy is hardly embraced before another intellectual who is black begins to attack it. So that it becomes suppressed, right?
Right.
So, or even sometimes just the intellectual and the artist, right? I mean, I was looking at titles, for instance. I was looking at a thing where, and I mean, I move in a lot of circles, but I mean, I was looking at the title of an essay that Bell Hooks wrote recently. Not attacking Bell Hooks. I'm just saying, for those, I love her, whatever, I'm just saying this. But I was looking at a title that Bell Hooks wrote of an essay that she wrote where she says, Beyonce is a what did you call her? Beyonce is an assassin or something like that. Because
an assassin, huh?
Yeah, she calls her something like an assassin because she's speaking about her newfound feminist theory, and she has a problem with Beyonce's positioning of her feminism, right, and how she actually posits it, and in a way it sort of bothered me. I mean, I felt like there was another way to possibly begin to talk about what might have been or what might not have been problematic about the artist's embracing of feminism and feminist principles,
Right.
Other than to say, Beyonce is an assassin,
Right.
or Ta-Nehisi Coates, and what we know of as the constant argument that's going on with people who I love and revere, like Dr. Cornel West, and on
Right.
and on and on.
Right.
There's a culture of where before we're allowed to bring out one thought, another one of us is coming about, sort of like suppressing an idea, and that begins to it sort of grates me in a way that
Yes.
I find incredibly problematic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's almost one of the, it's problematic, and it's also, though, constitutive of the black intellectual tradition. I mean, after all, Du Bois becomes the reigning black intellectual by attacking and taking down Booker T. Washington. And, in that Souls of Black Folk on Booker T. Washington and others. So that is part of the dynamic, right? That you essentially, it's almost an edible aspect of it. In that case, a younger man taking down an older man. What's kind of interesting about the current moment is the older men who are trying to take down the younger men, or the older women taking down, so that we have to now have almost like where we're trying to kill the children, because we feel that they don't respect the things that we have. But I also think there's a certain amount of rivalry and jealousy involved, because in a way, there's nowhere for the elder statesman black intellectual to go. You see, there's no, I mean, Bell Hooks is incredibly eminent, but where can she go to have an institution built around the ideas that she has? There really isn't. I mean, I'm sure she's got an appointment at a university or whatever, but there's not really an institution that will carry out her ideas. And then she sees a person from popular culture who comes along and kind of steals that, or
and brings it to the masses.
Yes,
right. Brings it to the masses in another way.
Yeah.
It's that thing in and around. Like, what do we understand, and how much do we begin to embrace about? And this again goes back to Locke. Right. How much do we begin to really embrace about the relationship between the intellect and the artistic? Right. These two movements. Right.
Right.
If I work primarily in academia, and that's fine. What might I not know about the world of popular culture? What might I not know about how popular culture operates and how it will actually mobilize people forward in a way that they will never begin to, where young people and movements will never begin to access, movements that are happening in the realms of academia. Do you understand?
Yes.
So what you might not understand. So there are lots of people actually who might be mobilized by hip hop who will not read Bell Hooks or who might not read Cornel West,
right.
but actually are moved by Chance the Rapper or whomever, what they might have to say.
Yes,
right?
because it gets back to that thing. The music is a mode of explanation.
Right.
Yeah, that Locke at least realized he had to come to terms with. And, I think that, you take something like Lemonade, I think this is just a profound cultural statement of sophistication at a level that you would never normally think of someone who's a singer coming up with, even just from a theatrical standpoint. I mean, people can argue with it technically, but I mean that's a profound statement, and I think to try and minimize that, I think it's that hardness of the journey for intellectuals often gets then reflected in their criticality toward people who maybe they feel don't have quite as hard a road to hoe, and I feel like that's a little bit of that with the bell hooks and of course just incredible wealth. I mean, I think Beyonce was like, something last year or something like, the 15th person to make the most money, more than Jay-Z. I mean, so that's another thing. In a capitalist society, the intellectual often, as a friend of mine used to say one time, I said, yeah, well, I'm writing this book. He said, yeah, but you ain't got no money. You ain't got no money, I'm sorry, So we're always up against that this society values money much more than intellect or criticism. And I think that's reflected in all sorts of intellectuals, but particularly black intellectuals up against art. Because art now is popular culture art, not so much the serious work that you do, brother. You know what I'm talking about?
Well, we were talking backstage about the work that I do and about the possibility of what's happening now. One of the things that I've done is that I think that it's been very important to me to constantly work in different realms of work in different artistic realms. To work with visual artists, to work with people in the theater, to work with music, to work with dance, to work in literature, to work with philosophers, and on and on and on. And so we have a clip of something I wanted to show because this became one of the latest things that I've done, which is a collaborative experience, and not just my collaborative experience. I mean, I worked as a writer with the visual artist, photographer Carrie Mae Weems. But what was brilliant about what she did is that she's responding to what was happening in America, the Black Lives Matter movement, and of course the assassinations, the deaths, the murders of young black people, right? And instead of just trying to, she's got a MacArthur, she's got her work, she's, certainly a profound artist. But instead, and she could have just responded to all of this herself, but she did not. She decided to bring in younger artists like myself, who's a writer, and Lisha Hall Moran, who's a singer, and other artists, so that we would all create a multi-media project that would respond to where we are right now, and do it through the realm of sort of Antigone in a way. Think about the right to bury our brothers, right, and bury our brothers in a certain way. I just wanted to show an excerpt of that, and about sort of as a way of speaking about sort of artistic coalition principles and what is possible.
You write something not because you have the answer, you write something because you know that you need to work through it.
Commemorating every black man who lives to see 21. Commemorating
Trayvon Martin,
Michael Brown,
Eric Garner.
Well, what is this piece? And then I thought, oh, well, really, this piece is very much like Antigone, isn't it? There are only like 10 stories in the world that we keep coming back to. And I thought, this is really the story of a woman, of a community that's trying to figure out how to bury her brothers. And they're denying her the right to do that, because they're denying that it has even happened, or that it warrants our attention. And she's saying, I'm gonna bury him, I'm gonna bury it right.
The woman tells the people that the bright light of history is now shining down on them, on you, on me. Exposed now, all things are unavoidable. In shame, some will turn away, but the crime remains. The age of innocence has passed, and we are now responsible for our own future.
The thing to me,
Yeah, we'll stop that. Yeah, it goes on longer, but yeah, because we have to take some questions from the audience.
That's the after party.
Right, but it's a bunch of artists, all poets, dancers, singers, where we're all coming together to create a work, to be responsible for our own future. Thank you so much.
Yes, and I want to say that, I'm so moved by what you're doing there because when I think about this book, while, of course, knowing about the past and the Harlem Renaissance and everything is very important, but I really would like it to be a means to bring attention to black artists and artists of color who are in theater, in dance, in music, in visual arts, who are doing so much now to respond to the contemporary moment. I mean, Locke would want that, not looking backward, but looking forward in terms of how can we use the arts to cope with the challenges today. And so I really very much like that we end with that. Thank you very much for coming.
So I think we're going to take some questions from the audience, and there'll be someone who's coming around with a microphone. If there's anyone who would like to ask any questions at all or respond.
Good afternoon or good evening. I think probably like a lot of people, as you were talking, I was thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement. I was thinking about Ta-Nehisi Coates, the Black Panther film, and all these things. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the current state of black genius? And I wanted to make a comment.
Black genius?
Black genius, because that was one of the things you were kind of talking about, the artistry, the intellectualism. But one thing that occurred to me, when Toni Morrison went to Switzerland and she won Stockholm and she won her Nobel Prize, her speech, she does this rhetorical trick where there's a blind old woman and some young people seem to be taunting her, and she is the wise oracle, and they're not respectful. And then halfway through the speech, she switches it, and it turns out that what they are looking for is guidance, which the old woman is not giving them, that as a generation we are failing the youth. And this occurred to me as you were talking. So can you speak to that in terms of artistry, intellectualism, especially with these things going on with one person killing the other? And actually Bell called her a terrorist.
Terrorist, thank you. Yeah, terrorist. Beyonce is the terrorist.
Right, she called her a
That's
terrorist.
the name of
And I just thought it was mean-spirited. And I thought, why don't you just go talk to the young woman? Why don't you teach her? Why don't you take on the mantle of the elder? Yeah, but if you can speak to that in the state of kind of where we are as a community and the genius that we see happening right now, politically and artistically.
Well, I just one thing I can say is that the key to the new Negro that Locke was talking about was really about the youth. In other words, the youth are a force of change. So one of the things that he brought forward, we always talk about race and class and gender, but he really focused a lot on generation. The idea of kind of that every 25 years a new kind of thought process comes about. And so I think the youth today are very powerful with the Black Lives Matter, and also the way in which the Black Lives Matter and black youth, I think, is beginning to have a catalytic effect more generally. I mean, I've been looking at the youth in the high school down in Florida and the way they have been organizing and standing up. While it's obviously very separate from, and people have been somewhat critical of them for that separation, that people are very concerned about those kids and not those killed by police. Nevertheless, they seem to be inspired to a certain extent, I think, by the Black Lives Matter youth. So I think youth is actually beginning to come up with some strategies that we haven't seen it play out of protest and consciousness raising like that period in the 1920s. We're already now cycling into the new century and coming up on 2020, and I mean, that sense of a generation born at the end of the last century who matures in the early part usually comes up with a certain amount of efficacy of that drives the conversation that's going to occur. So I'm optimistic about that part, that the youth seem to be searching and, coming up with strategies that are not just the same approach of the civil rights movement, particularly with new media and other things like that. I mean, the Beyonce bell hooks thing, I think I'll leave that to you, brother.
Though there's nothing to say about it other than what you said, which is that I lament the idea of our eating each other.
Yes.
But I think that you will never be able to suppress black genius, even when it is usurped, even when it is actually absconded, even when it is and it is constantly appropriated by other people in other cultures. But you'll never be able to suppress it, and I think that history has shown us that. It has actually spawned everything from the feminist movement to the gay rights movement to this movement that you're talking about with these the people in Florida trying to advocate for gun violence. Nobody actually cared whether or not black people were talking about guns and guns in our communities or whether or not we died. So that became sort of, at least in this administration,
Right.
not very well listened to, but it did spawn a movement. So you can't subtract blackness from the conversations that are being had today in and around the Senate committee, no matter how hard they try, right? So that's all I can possibly say about it, is that, we exist and
Yeah.
will. Anybody else? Another question? Yes.
Hello, I was wondering, like with the Harlem Renaissance, with the patrons controlling most of the art, what do you think some of the lessons should be for new artists to have more ownership and actually having our community to be buyers? Because I shot this documentary called Haiti's the Nation of Artists, and it was in the Pan-African Film Festival. When I noticed when I was in Haiti, most of the guys who owned all the art, all the galleries were European, even in a black country. And when you go to Africa, so it was like the same issues are still happening now.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just thinking of some new strategies that, and the outside community mostly buys art, but we don't. Essentially, the blacks or the Haitians or African, they're not the buyers of the art. So I just think some new strategies to empower us more as a community.
Yeah, well, I think that issue, Harold Cruz was, I think, the first to point that out, that, the Harlem Renaissance was producing art largely consumed by, white readers and patrons. But I think that it also did spawn some wider readership among black people. Not enough, perhaps, but some. And Locke perhaps learned from some of the lessons of dealing with Mrs. Mason and began to shift in the 30s away from personal patronage, where you have this one individual who has all this money and power, and so, their personality can essentially determine the outcomes, to more corporate and institutional forms of patronage. And particularly in the 1930s, when he created the bronze booklets, which was a series of booklets that were adult education booklets, around 100 pages, written in a fairly simple, straightforward language, that he got the Carnegie Corporation to give him money for. And then he sold these books on Negro art, Negro history, Negro music, as it was called, race theory, to working class and middle class black people throughout the United States. And I think his logic there was that he needed to basically create taste, create a readership for the material in the black community, rather than just aiming it for the people who are already sophisticated. And some of that also occurred in the 1960s, but essentially was stopped. So I think that's one of the things, is that you have to have, you can't lose track of the fact that the masses of black people generally don't have art, culture, sophistication that's actually aimed at them. And so, you know, that's something that I think needs to be taken very seriously as a project. Popular dissemination of these histories and this art. I do think there is a small burgeoning movement of black people who do purchase art and who, you know, maybe can't purchase the most expensive art. There are also artists who make art specifically so that it can be purchased by people who are not wealthy as part of their commitment as artists. So I think that, you know, having a consciousness of community and that the community is necessary to sustain the artist and the artist has an obligation to that community and that there's a dialogue and transaction back and forth. I think that's one of the key concepts that Locke tried to advocate for and that we could continue to advocate for, even though we know that there's still going to be these structural problems that, you know, we're not going to eliminate just simply. But I think aiming for the people and trying to write in such a way that people can understand what you're saying. I have this in my academic work. I've been criticized sometimes for not having enough post-structuralist language in my work, and it's not that I don't understand it. It's just I don't often feel like it's doing what I want to do, which is to reach a wide range of readers with a message that may be empowering to them. So I think that's part of it, aiming to do something for the community and having that community in mind when you create, I think is a very positive, you know, force.
I love that you found that humorous. And what you were saying about, you know, being accused of not having a lot of post-structuralist language in your work. You know, let me just say this: that I think that I still think and still believe that self-generating black art is important. When you were speaking about Haiti, one of the things that, you know, I was involved in for years actually was in writing a piece actually about Haiti and about you know, what was happening, what's happened to Haiti and what is happening to Haiti. There are artists that I involved in that project, like Edouard de Valcade, who is in Miami, who actually has who started the Haitian Cultural Arts Center there, where there's, you know, where it's a state-of-the-art center, and they're showing Haitian art. And if you go down to Miami for the Art Basel, you know, they're absolutely included, and the work is celebrated as well. The director, the film director who recently died, sorry I can't even call his name right now, owned so much Haitian work actually, but gave it back to the Haitian Cultural Arts Center before he died, which is really important. So it's all being exhibited there. I think models like that are important, and I think that we're seeing this also happen even in music. I mean, again, in popular culture, you know, we're seeing where people are beginning to move away from the models that we depended upon. The models like the music industry as it existed and as it was structured, the film industry as it existed and as it was structured, and figured out and are beginning to figure out ways to self-generate art so that it is sustainable. And I still think that I think that we have to also hold people like Thelma Golden and Kelly Jones, people who are very important actually in the conceptual art world and the expensive, you know, who are working with a lot of very famous new black artists, accountable. We have to, you know, not that they aren't being accountable, but I think that we have to continue to hold them accountable for creating a culture that allows us to access our own work, whether it is just to see it or to create it and or to buy it or to write about it. I think that we have to continue to house. Yeah, I think that's my thought. And I don't mean that exclusively. I don't mean that I think that, you know, white people have to be subtracted completely from the paradigm, but I do believe that we have to figure out how to house and not to be afraid of housing. Yeah. our own work. I think it's very important.
Hello.
Hi.
So, part of your comments, Jeffrey, about the academy and issues with how you're writing they're really structural in terms of the profession, in terms of academia, and that's a problem I think that many intellectuals have in terms of being able to reach a broader public and making their work connect to a broader public. So I want to address the fact that you have been involved in the museum world in the past, and then you moved into academia. And so you were in the realm of reaching the public
Yes.
with your work, and now you're still reaching the public in a narrower sense.
Right.
So I want to ask how you think about that change
Right.
in relationship to your work now. And then also, you all didn't address anything about the new National African American Museum and its place in housing African American culture on many levels, as well as historical artifacts.
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I think that I started out in, I guess you would say, in academia, in the sense that after getting my PhD, I got a teaching job at Tufts University, and then at UCLA, and then I went back to Washington, D.C. area, taught at George Mason University, and that's when I sort of started getting back into the Locke project. I had kind of moved away from it. And what was interesting about that is, at a certain point, I had to confront the fact that I had to grow a great deal as an intellectual and scholar and arts person in order to write the book about Locke. In other words, I mean, his education at Oxford, at Harvard, the Grand Tour, the knowledge he had was so extensive, and he did so many different things that at a younger period of time, it was just daunting to me. And so one of those things that I did is that I applied for a grant at the Smithsonian to work on, get back into the material. And I went to the National Portrait Gallery, and I discovered that that portrait that's on the cover and other portraits of African Americans was at the Portrait Gallery. In fact, I didn't even know that they were portraits. I just thought they were illustrations because I had only encountered them through that. And so when I got there, oh my God, these are actual paintings, well, pastels that were, life size. And so then I realized, okay, Locke was a curator. He essentially embraced using art as an educative and empowering force. And so I probably would have to know something about that. So I proposed to the Portrait Gallery to do an exhibit on Vino Rice's work, and worked for a couple of years doing that and put on that exhibition. And it was from that then I went on to work with the Anacostia Museum in the Smithsonian, trying to sort of embed this more in the community. But I think, what I learned is that I had to know something about objects and how you use objects to tell stories rather than words. That was part of what Locke was doing, because really by 1939, 1940, he was the premier curator in African American art, although largely no one knows that, right? I mean, so that was something that he mastered. And that is an art form itself. So part of that, though, does give you a sense of the public, as you're suggesting. So I remember when I was working at the Portrait Gallery and I was putting together this retrospective of Vino Rice's work, and I had, Native Americans, he did many of them African Americans, and I had a number of maybe 7 or 8 portraits of Asian Americans in there. So one of the curators there said, well, you only have about 6 or 7 Asian Americans in there. Why don't we just cut those out? So I knew actually that the reason that she wanted to cut it out was because one of the pictures of the Asian Americans was a semi-nude Asian woman who he had painted. So the sexual was in there, but it's not. Well, we don't have that many Asians come. So the woman said, well, we don't really have in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, we don't really have that many Asians even coming into the National Portrait Gallery. So I said, oh, okay, that's deep, So I said, well, I want it in there. I said, maybe you don't have them coming in because they don't see themselves in the museum. And so, having come through the Black Power movement, I was able to, in these little battles, these little curatorial battles, you have to have something that kind of pushes them back. So that pushed her back. So she left it in there because she didn't really want to come out and say, I don't want a nude woman in the ghetto, So the end of the show, I was walking through the last day, they're all up there. It's like all these brown people up in the gallery, right? And this woman comes and she said, there's so many Asians in here. Like they were violating the space, Right. I said, that's very interesting. I wonder why. And the first time I actually saw an Asian up in the National Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian National Gallery, right? So that taught me something. I kind of suspected it, but it's actually true. It's kind of like that baseball movie. You put it up, they'll come. But if you don't put it up, they will feel excluded. And so that's the power of public display and public exhibition, which is just tremendously powerful, that people can come and see themselves reflected, not just in the image, but in the institution. I'm part of America because I'm in the American Portrait Gallery, rather than just the presidents or just famous people, that actual people who lived and had a contribution to make. It was actually Alice Gilmore, Noguchi's sister, who was nude, could be up in the gallery. So I think that is an important politics, cultural politics that I learned from being in the Smithsonian. What I found, though, that the Smithsonian has its own politics too, right? And so when I was at the Anacostia Museum, I thought that I was going to be involved in all this grassroots stuff in Anacostia. And those people in that particular museum was concerned about what was going on downtown in the Smithsonian. So that's one of the things. We're always dealing with the gaze, as Cornel West says, the white normative gaze, which was the really important museums and exhibits were on the mall. And you out in Anacostia, you just out there with those black people and, it's less status. And so they were all trying to get downtown. I said, yes, but the people out here need something. So I ended up being a fish out of water in that circumstance. And so that's one of those black ironies, It's like, you think you're going into this like community-based thing and it's actually not. The other people are not thinking about it that way. So I then began to move back into the academic world. And really, when I came out to California in 2008, I somewhat left behind some of the curatorial work that I did when I was at George Mason. George Mason really supported me in doing public history, in evaluating me. Whereas some academic institutions will not value you doing a catalog or an exhibition as intellectual work. So I would like to do more curating and that sort of thing out here, but it just hasn't emerged. Maybe somebody from the Hammer will say
One final
something to
quick
me as
question,
I'm
please.
leaving.
One final question.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to ask a question about Locke in terms of Jessie Fawcett.
Yes.
Now we've been talking about, trying to suppress black genius.
Mm-hmm.
And Jessie Fawcett, as I'm sure you know, a contemporary of Zora Neale Hurston during the Harlem Renaissance. Zora Neale Hurston was the one that received all of the attention, and Locke, for some reason, seemed to constantly denigrate Fawcett.
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading, because I've done a lot of scholarship on Jessie Fawcett,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember hearing about, I can't remember which of her novels it was. I don't know if it was Plum Bun or the one before that, but there was a large party, a literary party that was supposed to take place
Mm-hmm.
for her because of this book.
Yes.
And Locke, I think he was the master of ceremonies,
Yes.
and he just totally lambasted it and took over the party.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, I got a whole chapter on that.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, I call that the dinner and the dean.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and that's all about this dinner, the civic club dinner,
Right.
that was proposed by a group of women who were in a writers group, and it was supposed to honor Jessie Fawcett. It really got taken over by Charles Johnson, who was the editor of Opportunity. So there were multiple rivalries going on. So there was a rivalry between Locke and, say, Fawcett, but there was also a rivalry between Opportunity magazine, which was the magazine of the Urban League, and The Crisis, which was the magazine of the NAACP. So Johnson didn't want to throw a party in which Jessie Fawcett would be the center of attention because she was working for Crisis. So he didn't want Crisis to get the credit for launching the Harlem Renaissance. So as I spent a lot of time on this because I've been dealing with this critique of Locke for a long time, and what I found is that while Locke was actually quite vicious and stupidly dismissive of her, he was actually manipulated by Johnson. Because when Johnson asked him to be the master of ceremonies, like you say, Locke immediately said, now, is this event to honor Jessie Fawcett's There Is Confusion, or is this to honor all of the other writers? And Johnson, oh, no, this is not about Jessie Fawcett. And Eric Walwyn, another person, came and said, oh, no, this is not about her. And so Locke said, well, if it's not about her, then I'll do it. But if it's about her, I don't want to do it. So they manipulated him so he would be the one who would be up there carrying out this agenda while Charles Johnson could sit back and say, well, we had a lovely occasion and blah, 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 blah. She was very hurt by the fact that the comments and everything that went on at this dinner, as she felt, was steered away from her. But one of the ironies I found is when I looked at the newspaper articles that were printed after the event, all of the newspaper articles, almost all of them, the New York World, others said, great event honoring Jessie Fawcett's There Is Confusion, right? And Charles Johnson was so mad about this that he went and wrote his own article about the event, carrying out his narrative. So I understand that she was very hurt by this in the sense that the internal politics of the event, right, didn't focus on her, but the external, the black newspapers, white newspapers who recorded this event, recorded it as actually an event that honored her. So I started thinking about that. Well, why is it? Why was Locke so obsessed with this? And I think Locke and Jessie Fawcett knew each other when he was even at Harvard as an undergraduate. And they were both from Philadelphia. And I found correspondence where it suggested to me that there might have been just a little bit of interest on the part of Jessie Fawcett in Locke at an earlier stage. And this was something that Locke often feared, that as an incredibly educated, sophisticated, seemingly eligible man, he would attract attention from middle-class black women. And so even before this, he would say things to his mother like, oh, Jessie Fawcett, she's not cultured, which was like absurd, right? I mean, it was like one of the most cultured, educated women who taught French, right? I mean, you know. So he was constantly kind of doing these little nasty things to her to keep her at bay. Then I think later on, he just felt that he was the person who was going to take over the movement, and she was kind of in the way. And so, you know, he carried out a thing. I think ultimately this was stupid on his part, because while he was attacking her, she was actually having an affair with W.B. Du Bois, who not long after that helped her leave this crisis. I guess it would have been a suit today, because he was no longer interested in her. And had Locke been nicer to her, he could have actually recruited her as a very powerful ally. And this is, I think, part of the tragedy in his life, that he had very lofty and complex and wonderful ideas, but his own personality and his way of handling conflict, particularly gender and sexual conflict, undermined people who could have been allies. And I think this is back to the point we're saying, is that these kinds of criticisms of people, I mean, they wound us. And she carried that wound to her grave, that Locke had done this thing to her, when he didn't have to do that. He could have said, oh, there's Jessie Fawcett's wonderful book. Stand up, Jessie, and take a bow, you know? And she would have just gleamed, and then he could have gone on and done his other thing. I also think that this was part of his program for a kind of gay takeover of the Harlem Renaissance. In other words, the people he was promoting, many of them were gay. And perhaps in his sense, there wasn't really room for both a feminist Harlem Renaissance and a gay Harlem Renaissance. But I think ultimately it was self-destructive, because I think if he had been able, she would have been available to be recruited after she was kicked to the curb by Du Bois. And she could have been a tremendous ally for him. There was also the other thing, which is that she was very, very taken by Langston Hughes. Jessie Fawcett was very, very taken and pursued Langston Hughes. I think everybody was pursuing Langston Hughes. And, Locke didn't play when it came to, going after the same object of affection. So that was another problem, right? She was too interested in the man that he was very much smitten by. So there were multiple levels to this conflict, but I really do, I spend a fair amount on it, saying that, in the end, this was one of the things that kept him from being more powerful. And it's something for us to think about, that these attacks that satisfy our short-term needs, often have this long-term consequence of undermining the very project that we've devoted our lives to.
I think there's a question over there.
Yeah, one more.
Yes, one more.
We actually don't have time for any more
You don't
questions.
have time for the? Okay.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.